next up we have Eric Drass, aka Shardcore, who has built a bunch of like really sort of boundary pushing bots, and he is going to speak on what is it like to be a bot. Thank you, Eric.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for remaining awake 4 hours in. This is the longest thing I've been to in a long time. I've made quite a lot of bots. Here's some of them. Some of them you may be familiar with. FactBot was one of the most popular, which generates a new lie every 4 hours. BFFBot is your best friend on Twitter. She likes everything you do. She writes your poetry, that kind of thing. She was killed by Twitter quite early on. There's a theme you'll see as I go through these bots. FuturistBot takes the piss out of futurists relentlessly. GlitchNN is the glitch news network, which compresses the latest news into 2 seconds. So it takes the last sort of 60 images and spits them at you very quickly. AlgoBola was an experiment in building a social media virus. That one lasted, I believe, 16 hours before Twitter killed it. They don't like it when you start spamming lots and lots of people with lots and lots of stuff. Theresa Maybot I'm particularly proud of. In the spirit of punching up, Theresa Maybot is a Twitter bot that never tweets. All she does is add you to suspicious lists, things like person of interest or deep HMRC search, that kind of thing. MIA ArtBot is machine imagined art. I took the JSON data of the Tate collection and used it to generate theoretical artworks. And due to the delights of combinatorial explosion, there are 88 nonillion possible artworks it's currently working through. And the one I'm most proud of recently is TrippingBot. She starts taking drugs at 6 p.m. every night for 6 hours. And she gets increasingly wasted. She's actually one of the more sophisticated bots under the hood. She's trained on a character-level recurrent neural network, which I've trained on the corpus of Erowid drug experiences. And the performance of the network is effectively rewound. So she starts off relatively coherent, but by the end of the night, she can't even speak. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about my bots tonight. I'm going to talk about this stuff. Yada, yada, yada. I'm going to call it that shit. And the question I'm going to be asking is, what is it like to be a bot? This is a play on words based on a very famous philosophical paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat by Thomas Nagel, published in 1974 and is known as the most widely cited and influential thought experiment about consciousness. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, we need to think about thinking, which thankfully philosophers have been doing for quite a while. So I'm going to give you a little crash course in some philosophy of mind and how it relates to what we think of bots. This is the Wikipedia definition, which is that it's a branch of philosophy that studies the nature of the mind, mental events, that kind of stuff. Alan Turing talks about intelligence here as if a machine acts as intelligent as a human being, then it is as intelligent as a human being. That doesn't really work very well. It's slightly anthropocentric. It makes more sense to talk about an intelligent agent. A lot of the bots that have been discussed today could be classed as intelligent agents that act to maximize the expected value of performance, yada, yada, yada. There's problems with this definition too, but generally people are using things like algorithm or bot in a very broad sense, which basically comes down to, woo, computers. I was at Future Everything last year and Warren Ellis drew an analogy between technology and magic. So maybe we should get our business cards altered to magician rather than data scientist. Magician sounds way better. So I'm going to ask you to think about these two, Eric and Derek. Derek is a bot, Eric is a person. And let's look at some philosophy of mind behind that. So the first one would be the mind-body problem. So what's the relationship between the mind and the body? We express ourselves as conscious living creatures that know stuff and can talk to other conscious living creatures. But where does it come from? Does it come from this kilo of fat in my skull? Well, probably, but it feels a bit more than that. But if it does come from this kilo of fat, then that kilo of fat is made of biological stuff, which could be described as chemistry, which could be described as physics, which eventually comes to maths. So it makes sense that, you know, a sophisticated machine that's very good at maths, like a very, very big computer, ought to be able to do the same kind of thing as a biological brain. It doesn't really feel like that. It feels like we've got something special. It feels like there's something unique about our individual experience. How many of you in the room think you have an immutable soul? Tough crowd. For those of you watching on the internet, no one here has a soul. But if you do have a soul, you've got a problem with how that soul interacts with your body. And, you know, as you can see, botists aren't really dualists. They like the idea that the stuff that we think of as ourselves is coming out of this biology. So if we follow this reasoning, Derek, our putative, fantastic bot that does wonderful maths very, very fast, could be a mind, like our minds. There's no reason why he can't be, if we're a reductionist. The other problem we face with bots, related to bots, is the idea of other minds. I look around and see all of you, and I assume you have minds. I assume you have a mind like mine. But I can never actually know. I can never have any direct experience of what's going on inside your head. So what we tend to do is use analogy. I think, oh, well, you look like things like me, so you probably are like me, so I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you are, in fact, humans like me and have conscious experience like I do. But I don't know that. Our bot Derek could be sitting in this room right now looking very sophisticated, kind of flesh-covered mechanical machine, and I wouldn't necessarily know if he was able to behave convincingly as a human. Then, you know, if I saw him as a human, I'd have to think he was. One of these features, of course, is consciousness. We're quite attached to that. It feels kind of important that we have conscious awareness. We call it the self. And I think a lot of our feelings about AI, or that shit, as I called it earlier, kind of comes down to how we think about consciousness. It seems very special and unique and wonderful and magical, and no one really knows how it emerges from this kilo of flesh in our brain. So expecting that Derek the bot is going to be able to produce a conscious state just with some fancy programming seems like a bit of a stretch. Is consciousness actually important? That's a whole other kettle of philosophy. It certainly feels like it. Which brings us to Nagel's paper, which is, what is it like to be a bat? So this is a thought experiment. So think about the bat. What can the bat do that you can't? A bat can see the world through echolocation, use a series of clicks, and respond to the clicks that come back. That's something that I can't do. I can learn all about the bat. I can dissect bats. I can even look in their brains. I can have a deep scientific understanding of what a bat is, but I never really know what it's like to be a bat. There's something about the battiness of a bat that only a bat can ever know. And the same holds true for our friend Derek. So if we compare them, there's Eric. He's biological. He's embodied. I evolved to get here through a series of other creatures that were slightly similar to me and slightly different, going back in time. I've got limited processing. I've got imperfect memory. And I've got more or less 5 senses. Now, the bat, which inspired such interesting philosophical thoughts, is very similar in a lot of ways. Except he's got an extra sense. A sense of seeing the world with echolocation. I can't really understand what it is. I can't understand what it is to be a bat. But if we look at our bot friend, if the bat causes problems, the bot causes even more problems. It's made out of silicon. It's distributed. Lives across the whole planet, doesn't live in an embodied shell. It's programmed, generally. Potentially has unlimited processing. Got a perfect memory. Bots never forget. And we've no idea quite what the sensory faculties of a bot-like system really is, because they don't have senses like ours. They don't have eyeballs and nostrils or whatever. You know, the best way of thinking of them is the fact that they're aliens. They're the closest thing to an alien species that we're going to get our hands on. They're certainly unlike any other kind of intelligence that we experience on Earth. Yet we tend to look at them and talk about them as if they are intelligent creatures kind of like humans, but they're really not. I think the problem with that is to do with what's known as folk psychology. We have a brilliant set of words to describe how we feel about the world and our internal states. And we use them to talk to other humans. If I turn to you and say, I'm really happy, you kind of know what that means. But there's no real descriptive kind of scientific breakdown of happiness that we can use. We don't need it, because we're all humans here. We can talk about happiness. This is what's known as folk psychology. It's very quickly and very simple for us to use these terms in our day-to-day lives to talk about the world, because we're in a world of humans. And when we use these words, other humans will understand them, and the world keeps turning. Not the same for bots. You know, if you were to consider the internal mental state of Google's search rank algorithm, that doesn't really make any sense. Right? But it's an internal state of sorts, but it doesn't one that lends itself to any language that we can use. So I can explain what's going on to some extent in an algorithm, but it's not quite the same as being it, which is much the same as Nagel's point about the bat. You can never really know what it is. And because we live in a world of other minds, we have this idea of perceived intentionality. We tend to think that there is intention in others, in their actions and their words. Example would be, my daughter was recently studying plants at school, and as I was walking to school, she said, does a plant have to be happy to flower? We don't really ascribe a mental state of happiness to a plant, but I knew what she meant. And we had a great discussion about what it might mean for a plant to be happy or not. We can use these terms quite easily in the world. But that's not really how it is anywhere else. If we look at algorithms, we can ascribe intentionality to algorithms as well. I mean, this sorting algorithm clearly looks like it wants to sort things in the right order. You know, it feels like it has an intentional state, even though we know it's just a heuristic on some data. But we can't help but ascribe an intentional state to it. And this brings us back to some Twitter bots. Intentionality is really important with the law. The difference between murder and manslaughter is one of intention. Does it work for bots? This guy, Jeffrey Van der Goot, built a bot that made a death threat. Police turned up. So he had to explain what Twitter bots are to the police. And the police then said, you're responsible for what your bot said. Well, that's an interesting, those of us who make bots, that's an interesting problem, right? Are we actually responsible for what we're saying? You know, hence, you have to start putting moderation in. I mean, I find that I have to moderate my bots for similar reasons. But are we responsible for what they say? No. This is another great recent project, the Random Darknet Shopper, from Median Group and Bitnik. And they gave their bot $100 of bitcoins every week and said, go and buy something on the darknet and deliver it to the gallery. And pretty soon, delivered them some ecstasy. Also delivered them fake designer jeans and trainers and locks that would open any door in the city. But they had no direct intentional relationship between the actions of their bot. All they did is gave it some money, said, go on tour, buy something. And thankfully, because this was in the Netherlands, the gallery was very supportive and displayed all the things very nicely. And the police came around and said, "Thank you very much," took the drugs away, and everything carried on. Not sure that would happen in London, but depends where you are. So what we're doing as botists in this world of burgeoning intelligence is we're just dealing with this little bit, right? We're dealing with bots, deal with humans. And that's fine. But that's not really where superintelligence is going. There's a lot more botting going on. There are a lot more entities in the system generating representations about their knowledge of the system and talking to other entities in the system. And the humans have been left behind. We're just on the fringes for that kind of thing. They're making data-driven representations of the world that we can never really understand. I just put this one because I saw it the other day and it was really summed up quite nicely. I don't know what it does, but never turn it off. That seems to be generally the approach to machine learning. About a year ago, Google did this, and lots of people lost their minds. I have personal problems with the term deep learning, having studied neural networks way back in the 90s. I used to run neural networks on computers that are far less powerful than the telephones you were holding in your hands. So imagine what Google can do. If you get enough CPU cycles and throw enough data at it, they can do some quite interesting stuff. I actually find this deep dream stuff a bit of a subterfuge on Google's part, because what we're doing here is inverting a neural network, throwing noise at it, and seeing what it comes out the other side. Here's one I did of Alan Moore. It's an anomaly in the world of neural networks, the deep dreaming stuff, because we can turn it back into visual stuff that we can look at. And anyone who's ever taken psychotropic drugs really understands what's going on in this neural network. But that doesn't work for PageRank algorithms, it doesn't work for other data analysis tools. And in fact, if you look at what it's doing, these are some of the responses of the image classification stuff that we've seen recently. You know, you can throw those pictures at it, and that's what the neural network thinks it sees. So all the stuff that Eric has that Derek doesn't, or the fact that I'm a human who's evolved with other humans who are fleshy and have limbs and, you know, have heads near the top and all that kind of stuff, all this stuff that we take for granted is not actually apparent inside the data these things are trained on. So they can produce behavior that very much feels like human recognition, but they're really not doing it at all. This, of course, is the other classic example. These systems only reflect back the data that they've got. So Google produced this magical sort all my photo system, labeled black people as gorillas. Made people very understandably very upset. This is reflecting back the data that it was given. Data is full of, you know, West Coast bros and not particularly representative or diverse. I use the same system on Alan Moore. It tells me it's a piranha. You know, so we're going to wrap it up very quickly. So what does it look like now? We've got humans creating data, lots of us. We've also got bots making data in the system as well. They're also adding to this cultural sea of information. And there's lots of us. And quite a lot of what we end up reading is the representations that machines are making. They're reading all this data coming into the system. They make a summary of it, present it back to you, be it in algorithmic journalism or a pretty picture or a video. It becomes more complicated when there's a lot of systems, a lot of bots. And then the bots start looking at the other bots. What the fuck is this guy thinking? It's very difficult for us to know as humans quite how it works through a machine. Here's another great recent tweet, which I think summarizes it quite nicely. Twitter is very complicated. I no longer know whether they're humans or not. To which some bot perhaps said, are you a real account? So I'll wrap up very quickly. Bots and art. I'm an artist by nature, and what does art do except enrich human experience? I'm sure we're all watching with trepidation now that Kik has launched a bot marketplace, and apparently Facebook are not far behind. So that could mean that us botists are on the cusp of something huge, and we're finally going to get paid. Personally, I'm a lot less enthusiastic, particularly when I read this in The Guardian. The H&M bot injects an inquisitive sale associate into your online shopping experience. I could think of nothing worse than that. I tend to think of culture itself as an organism that we're all feeding into. It doesn't exist in any one human, it doesn't exist in the world, it exists in the books, and it exists in all of our brains, and it's shared between us. And it's historically perceived to be a uniquely human thing. But I don't think it is anymore. I think now that bots are getting involved in generating cultural content and commenting on cultural content that humans make, it becomes very important that we recognize that we're not unique in this little game anymore. That these artificial intelligence systems are doing things that we are inferring to be human-like when they're really, really not. And perhaps we should just be a little more careful about what's going on under the hood. Thank you very much.